Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture for week 7. This lecture is focusing on the media and how the media can influence politics and how the media mediates other forms of political participation. So we're going to talk about the role of the media and how it's changed over time and analyzing the media through the 3 faces of power. So what is the media? Well, it's a means of communication and information spread. Like the word, it's literally a medium for how information and communication spreads throughout the population. We should think of it as distinct from public relations, right? These aren't just the media is in theory independent from particular political candidates, parties, corporations, etc., and has this independent function to mediate this information flow. We can think of the media to include everything from newspapers and magazines to the radio, to television, both news and entertainment, the internet, social media, websites, etc. And it has a variety of functions. It provides content, and that content isn't always news, right? That content is entertainment. That content is sports, cooking shows, dramas, sitcoms, etc. It generates revenue. It's business, right? All of the media corporations, right, except for things like PBS and NPR, are profit-seeking enterprises. In theory, at least in its ideal form, right, the media should provide some sort of public accountability, right? It should investigate and report on corruption and scandals and failures of public policy. It should provide information to the citizens about what's going on, to provide accountability for elected representatives. And the media should promote the public good in theory, right? That the media itself is a public good, and it should promote kind of like some values for the public, right? It shouldn't just simply be a race to the bottom. Now, the media has shifted over time. Obviously, the first forms of media were print media and go all the way back to the revolutionary times. In the early days of the American Republic, most of the presses were run by political parties. It was this period of the party press where different newspapers were basically ideological organs of the different political parties. They would publish hit pieces and reporting on that would favor their own political persuasion. This eventually gives way to the independent press and the development of kind of muckraking and investigative journalism around the progressive era, early 20th century. The development of radio media provide greater direct access to the public, right? Anyone can just tune into the radio. It allowed for FDR's famous fireside chats. It allowed for you to be able to hear people's voices and hear things live, broadcasting things live, and not just reporting on them after the fact. This similar kind of trend develops into television. Televised media. So we have the rise of telejournalism, famously with people like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, who are able to like bring current events into your living room, whether it was, especially in the second half of the 20th century, things like presidential debates, the Vietnam War, the kind of interviews and journalism around the McCarthy affair, right? All of these things kind of bring the images into your living room, became much more visceral. Let's have the emergence of televised campaign ads, debates. But this really shifts towards the end of the 20th century with the rise of cable systems, where we have a shift from what's known as the affiliate model, in which you have like your local NBC affiliate that they get content from NBC, but they also have local news and local programming, etc. In addition to specialized channels that provide specialized content, right? Things like not just CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, but also things like Bloomberg TV and ESPN and the Food Network. And so rather than having a bunch of general interest things, you have highly specialized programming that really shapes the way that people engage with it, because you can just kind of select into the media that you're consuming rather than everyone kind of watching the same evening news on ABC or NBC. This also leads with the development of 24-hour cable news channels, the 24-hour news cycle, the kind of constant coverage of political news. We have the rise of the internet in the late 20th and early 21st century, which leads to the decentralization of the media. You have the kind of spreading out, you have kind of, especially with the rise of social media, you don't really have a single kind of authoritative mouthpiece of information, but it's kind of spread throughout vast ecosystems, and this leads to misinformation, fake news, the rise of citizen journalism, and people kind of taking the news into their own hands. And that's really kind of shaped our media environments and further fragmented our media environment. We're no longer all kind of reading the same newspaper stories or watching the same nightly news reports. So the First Amendment, as you all know, includes includes the protection that Congress shall not abridge the freedom of the press. And so there are limits to this, however. For example, there are laws against slander and libel that you cannot slander, which is speaking false information with an intent to harm or a person or entity, and libel is printing false information with the intent to cause harm. And now there's a couple of key distinctions here that libel and slander only occur when you're printing false information. If you're printing true information that causes harm, that is protected. Also, if you're presenting like an opinion piece, right, that might cause harm, they are protected because they are not claiming statements as facts, but are statements of opinion. And the second key idea here is it's up to the defamed person to prove slander and libel, and I bring a lawsuit. And there's lots of case law that protects like the media against slander and libel when the claimant is a public figure, right? That it's much harder to prove that when someone has put themselves in the public eye. There's also prohibitions against publishing classified material. This became famous with the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court ruled that while the government can impose prior restraint on the media, meaning that the government can prevent the publication of this information, that right is very limited. The court gave the newspapers the right to publish much of the Pentagon Papers, but the revelation of troop movements in the name of undercover operatives are some of the few approved reasons from which the government can stop publication or reporting. That being said, there's still significant regulations over the media. The Radio Act of 1927 created limits on obscene or biased material in the name of the public interest. You couldn't just like transmit pornography. You couldn't just transmit biased material over the radio that was deemed as bad for the public. In 1934, the Communications Act created the Federal Communications Commission to enforce regulations and determine what is appropriate content. For a long period of time, political media was governed by the equal time rule. That candidates must be given equal time. This didn't count for news, but it does kind of include comedy shows, and it does include kind of like interviews, so that you have to like give candidates equal time. Between the 1940s and 1980s, there was what was known as the Fairness Doctrine was in effect. This kind of rule asserted that all issues must be covered in a balanced way. This was eventually gotten rid of, but the idea here was that if you're going to present a controversial issue, you have to present it in a way that is unbiased and balanced. Of course, many people have criticized the Fairness Doctrine because it required you to tell two sides of a story, and it could have been the case, as like we now talk about climate change and things like that, but there really aren't two sides of the story. There are also regulations on indecency and obscenity. You can't have pornography on there are regulations about you can't just have pornography on network television. There are regulations about obscene and indecent media and how that can be presented. And in 1996, the Telecommunications Act dropped the limits on how many stations a media conglomerate could own. And this is really important because this allowed for the concentration of media, different forms of media, into a kind of like single media empires, right? So in 1993, 50 companies owned 90% of all the media in the country. But by 2019, 90% of the media was owned by only 6 companies: Comcast, Disney, 21st Century Fox, Time Warner, Viacom, and CBS. And so we have this combination of proliferation of media, that there's so many news outlets, there's so many kind of newspapers and magazines and websites and blogs and etc. But at the same time, 90% of media is owned by 6 companies. And so we have this concentration of media into different conglomerates, which then gives these companies a significant amount of power over how what the content is produced, how information is spread. And this means that we're going to have a narrowing of kind of, despite this expansion and proliferation of social media, the narrowing of the kind of official media channels. So if we're thinking about the media through it's really helpful to think about the media through the second and third phases of power, because the media itself is a medium. It's not doesn't mobilize resources directly, but it influences how political competition and political participation occurs. So one way we can think of its non-decisional power is through the power of agenda setting, the ability to determine what is viewed as important and what gets talked about. This is some research from a few years ago. It's looking at the number of kind of media coverage of the Notre Dame fire versus the Amazon rainforest fire in the same year. And it really kind of shapes what we view as important, what kind of grievances and issues we're going to talk about, and really kind of mobilizing a bias towards certain issues and over other issues, right? This is the act of choosing which issues deserve public discussion. And the media has immense power to frame what we talk about. The kind of what's on the front page in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, what's on the cover of Time magazine, what the kind of cable news shows are talking about, who gets invited to, the big Sunday morning political talk shows, all will kind of shape how we perceive and talk about certain issues and political issues. But we can also think about the conglomeration of the media. They're going to mobilize bias in particular ways, right? If you have the concentration of media into the hands of a few companies, these companies can really determine what we're going to talk about, and they're probably not going to run a lot of stories on breaking up large corporations or greater regulation of the media or antitrust lawsuits or any of these things that might be threatening to their own interests. So if we wanted to kind of add to our constantly evolving chart on the 3 phases of power and influencing public policy, right? We can add media agenda setting to the second phase of power, mobilizing the bias, kind of creating this wall against the kind of pluralist model in which people form interest groups and to leverage their resources in order to influence public policy. That they have to kind of get through. They have to get through these biases that include institutional barriers like gerrymandering and voter suppression, that include the exclusions of interest group memberships like Schneider was talking about, but also the way that the media is going to just exclude certain issues from the public sphere and public debate. But what about the third phase of power? Here we can think of the media having various ideological and framing effects. So the first thing to think about is how does the media influence us? And there have been a lot of different theories. Walter Lippmann in the early 20th century, he argued that the media has a hypodermic theory, that it's literally and directly injecting opinions and information into our bloodstreams. But this has kind of been challenged, that it's by scholars who have found that the media has really a limited effect on changing public opinion. And instead, more people argue for a kind of cultivation theory, that what the media does is it develops people's worldviews by presenting a vision of a shared reality. That it's not so much that they directly shape your opinions and tell you what to think, but they help give us a sense of what is real in the world and what is going on around us. And this can occur through framing effects that create narrative or context that affect how the same information is perceived or understood. So often we think of kind of whether things are episodic or thematic. Episodic kind of framing was going to focus on isolated details. We're going to look at things completely decontextualized, where a more thematic framing is going to look at 2 broader issues, like whether or not we report the effects of a particular storm in the context of climate change or not is going to shape how we think about it. Whether or not we kind of tell how we frame stories in the context of broader economic trends or broader social and political trends shapes the way we think about that story. But we can also frame things in terms of media biases. There's demonstrated racialized biases in the media. The media is more likely to discuss crime and poverty in the context of race. And as we see in this kind of famous story about Hurricane Katrina, these kind of different framing, these different ways that pictures were captioned when it's a Black resident of New Orleans. This is after looting a grocery store and this is two white residents are wading through chest deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store, right? This kind of racialized bias, and there's also demonstrated gender biases in media coverage. That female candidates and business leaders are less likely to receive positive coverage, and there's actually been correlations between the negative media coverage that women candidates receive and the fact that women are less likely to run for office than men. But we can also think of media polarization, that conglomerations and these kind of narrow, despite the proliferation of media, but the narrowing of media into just a few companies allows for the creation of partisan echo chambers. And that this partisan media is going to shape how people perceive the political world, right? So if you have, and this is kind of just a chart, it's like ranking on both the level of kind of fact-based reporting or just kind of like made up nonsense to left or right, right? If someone is only getting their news from, this side and this side, right? You're going to end up with you're going to operate and have very different worldviews, where if everyone is kind of always getting their news from, let's say, like Associated Press and Reuters, if everyone's kind of have that shared worldview. But these partisan echo chambers have real effects on the way that people understand the political world. For example, this is from this past spring, that different media diets actually changed the way that people thought about COVID-19. That people who consumed mostly right-leaning the Republicans who consumed right-leaning news outlets tended to think that the media exaggerated the risks, where Democrats who consumed across the left-leaning outlets thought that they had more or less gotten the bias right. Now, of course, that these exaggerated risks decreases the more that they consume media that is not kind of right-leaning, right? But we can also look at how, if you consumed right-leaning media, that people were more likely to believe that the COVID-19 was developed intentionally in a lab, versus if people who consumed only left-leaning audiences did not believe that. But we get this kind of reversion to the mean here, the more people are consuming less biased media, right? That if you're consuming outlets without left-leaning audiences, you're going to have, it's very similar numbers as Republicans who consume media without right-leaning biases. So we're literally creating different worlds through the different media environments that we're inhabiting. And so this is from a report from January of 2020, that we really do live in these media bubbles, that 20% of Democrats and those who lean Democrat tuned only to these kind of blue left liberal leaning news sources, and about 20% of Republicans and those who lean Republicans turned only to right-leaning news sources, right? So there's no real overlap, and people aren't turning to kind of the same media. So we're literally hearing different stories, we're hearing about different things that are important. And so when we're talking about politics, we're talking about very different things depending on what media we consume. And this is only going to further fuel social sorting, right? This idea that different political, the media that we consume becomes part of our political identity, and that Republicans and Democrats consume different media, both news media, but also different types of entertainment media. And this is going to shape our view of what's important, right? We might prioritize different issues depending on the framing effects and the priming effects of the media, the agenda setting effects of the media that we consume, but also the view of the political opposition, right? If you think that we have nothing in common with them, that we're going to view the political opposition as crazy or deranged or wrong or bad or threatening, because we're being fed that from the media that we consume. And we have a different sense of reality that we think. This has been very clear with things like climate change and COVID, that people who consume different media have different conceptions of the level of risk and threat these create. And this creates this self-fulfilling cycle. Polarized audiences, right? If you have social sorting and great degree of polarization in the population, then news companies are going to produce more polarized content to maintain the audiences, right? Fox News is going to move further and further to the right, MSNBC is going to move further and further to the left in order to maintain those audiences. And that's going to keep audiences more polarized and create a kind of vicious cycle where you always have to move toward the ideological extreme. And we see this in this shift in conservative media consumers away from Fox News, which has not been viewed as not conservative enough, to kind of extreme right wing, not reputable even by Fox News standards, not reputable news sources like the One American Network and Newsmax. And that's only going to kind of further intensify polarization. So now we can kind of add in the media to our to our chart of power. And so here we can think about how media framing and biases, in addition to things like American political culture, are going to shape the values that people have even before they mobilize into interest groups. These interest groups are going to, exert exclusion through the second phase of power, having greater information, having greater money. They're going to exclude certain voices from political decision-making power. And that's all going to get filtered through these various institutional and barriers, as well as interest group membership exclusions and media agenda sending effects. And so what we end up seeing is, like, unlike the kind of rosy pluralist model that whoever can mobilize the most votes is going to get their public policy demanded, that we have a much more complex view of how public policy gets made in this country. That people have power, but that power is shaped by ideology and sociological factors, and that power is limited by these institutional factors, this mobilization of bias. So next week, we're going to move away from kind of power, influence, and participation to thinking more about the formal political institutions at the national and the state levels. We'll be starting first with Congress, Article 1 of the Constitution, thinking about both about the institutional design of Congress, as well as the legislative process and congressional behavior after spring break. And the minute paper question for this week, again, you can go to bit.ly/Pauls101NP. Describe the role of the media in influence public policy. Do you think that this should be reformed? So that is the question for the week. Don't forget to ask any questions in that thread and in that forum that you have that you want to talk about in discussion section. That's it for the lectures for this week. I look forward to continuing these conversations in discussion section. I'll see you then.